They suggest human behaviour is as critical as code to understand. It calls people both risk inducers, so attackers, malicious insiders. So you're either a risk inducer or a risk mitigator, so you're an ethical defender or a vigilant user. Try putting that on your Tinder profile. Where the bloody hell have you been?
We've been busy doing other things, haven't we? We've been some other side projects, been busy with life, been busy with studies.
Yes, sorry, dear listeners. We have not abandoned you forever. When our final episode ended, I think it was December, we had lots of intentions of sort of coming back, but as Jeff said, life kind of got in the way. But it did give us an opportunity to think about what we want to do with this show next. Riding high off 2 award-winning accolades, we felt like we do want to continue, but maybe in a new format. Dare I say, a new compromising position.
Well, saucy.
Well, you know, as Prince says, we've been together too long. We've got to make it better. We've got to try a new position. So let's try a new compromising position. I think we will still focus quite heavily on cyber, but there's many other ways that we can be in a compromising position, which allows us to bend over backwards for you and talk about some really interesting things. So the format will change slightly, but you will still get your heady fix of technology, cybersecurity, AI, dev, anything kind of tech, but with that lovely human slant on it still.
Absolutely.
And a fun format we're going to try and work with at the moment is we've been doing lots of academic research and reading, and we thought it'd be really interesting if part of the format of our new compromising positions would be to share some of that research with you and actually put it into context, because we're in a very lucky position at the moment that we've got access to all these research papers and the time to look over them. But we realise actually it's no good them being stuck on online journals, places like that. We need to put them in the hands of people actually doing the do so they can learn from it. So the new compromising position is academic discovery, but all very much having practical applications to our lives as technologists. What do you think of that then, Jeff?
Well, I think it's great because it's very easy for the world of academia to get too lost in its own research, and it's very easy for, I think, the world of the practitioners, the world of industry, to completely ignore the fact that there's actually very important research going on in topics such as cybersecurity. I think it's really important to bring some of this to life, but also, frankly, there's a lot of papers out there, and there's a lot of very long papers out there, and I think maybe bringing just a taste of those papers to people without them having to read the entire thing themselves is probably, hopefully, useful for people. And there's also putting our own slant on it, bringing the world of industry and academia together a bit closer with our own thoughts on how we can actually do some of this in reality.
Yep, sounds good to me. I call it bringing the big brain on Brad by bridging the gap between academia and real life examples of how we would apply this in our organisations, and hopefully preventing yourself from becoming in a compromising position. So let's get started then. Today's paper is one I've picked, and it is titled Characterizing and Measuring Maliciousness for Cybersecurity Risk Assessment. And it was published in Frontiers in Psychology journal, and the lead author is Zoe M along with others. Full disclosure, this was published in 2018, so we will be pointing out little areas where we think, is that still applicable today? Because there is, even though it's 2018, that in tech terms, that might as well be a million years ago.
Exactly. Yes. I think most foreshadowing pre the generative AI era.
Yeah. So I'm going to just kind of briefly summarize what this paper is about. So this paper discusses the term maliciousness, which they describe as the intent to cause harm. Now, in this paper, they are proposing a new framework that explicitly integrates human maliciousness into cybersecurity risk assessments by examining it across 4 levels of social organization. They describe that as the individual, the macro, the meso, and the micro. And I've done that out of order. But it's basically what it means is think of a human being as an onion. The individual is the very core of the onion, and then around it is all the other layers, and then the final layer is all the kind of juicy stuff around sort of the way society is organized around itself, and how all those layers can have an impact on people's proclivities to be more malicious. That's it in a nutshell. Yeah.
What I do particularly like about this paper, though, is it's quite a good discussion. It's not just a literature review. I mean, it contains contains, obviously, as many academic papers do, contains a lot of references to other works. But what it does do is, I think, lean in a lot of insight and give a lot of opinion on things. Plus some actually very useful diagrams as well. I think
absolutely.
They systematise it quite well in this paper. I think it's very nice to see that they're looking at things like what are the 4 key human factors. They talk about some of the psychological elements, like the original sort of big 5 personality traits, and then talking about things like the dark triad.
I love the description of the dark triad. It automatically made me think of our beloved Ozzy Osbourne. It sounds very heavy metal, the dark triad of personality, but we'll go into more of that later.
Yeah. We can describe what's in the dark triad later on, I think. Yeah. But then also like outlining the 4 key human factors too: benevolence, rationality, expertise, stroke competence, maliciousness, and insider access, which are interesting because that covers a bunch of different, I guess, practical or psychological things. Insider access is probably, for me, the most interesting part of this is really the insider threat elements of it, because, as much as I'm interested in some of the forces around how people outside of your organization might be motivated to attack or might be motivated to join a group that attacks, I'm not sure how much difference that makes to an actual attack when it's coming from the outside. But on the inside, if we can help detect and prevent insider threats, I think that's hugely interesting, or should be hugely interesting, to the cybersecurity community. That might actually be actionable.
Well, let's see if it is. So I'm gonna start story time. So listeners, so you don't actually have to read it if you don't want to. I would recommend it, and it's freely available. We've just double checked. You don't have to be in academia like we are to be able to look into it. But I will play Jackanory story time edition, probably Rick Mail's kind of time. That's what the kind of vibe I want to go for. So the paper discusses how they want a more holistic approach, and having a more holistic approach, that's totally our bag on this show. Too often we focus too much on the technology side of things. And we were discussing this paper yesterday, Jeff, and you were talking about actually the technology side. It's almost taking care of itself now. It's almost got to a point, aside from misconfiguration, where it's good enough really to prevent against most attacks if you do it well.
And I think the figures are showing this. We've seen a number of research figures to show that attacks against the human are on the increase.
Yeah, because the humans are the nice, squishy layer to prod and poke at. That's how you're going to get in these days, 9 times out of 10, when it comes to cybersecurity. So this paper back in 2018 already calling for a more holistic approach that considers human factors, and I am living for it. So they explain that things like rationality, expertise, and maliciousness are key human characteristics in influencing cyber risks within this context. But the idea of maliciousness in the kind of discourse, particularly in cybersecurity, is really poorly characterized according to them. According to them, we don't really, when we talk about maliciousness in cybersecurity, we don't really talk about it in the way that they think is actually beneficial to us. We don't really talk about what it actually means to be a proper wrong'un. They suggest that when we discuss maliciousness in cybersecurity, we just refer to it as, for example, malicious code. We again reframe it back into the technical, rather than following that line that someone somewhere has had to write, a person maybe nowadays, who knows, with AI vibe coding, but someone has had to write this piece of code and have the impetus to want to do malicious harm. And just as a reminder, the term maliciousness is the intent to do harm, and that's what we're looking at here. We're not looking at insider threats who do things by accident or due to other pressures. This is someone who actively wants to cause harm,
or even white hat hacking. It's it's the study of the factors that leads to a malicious act. And then the question is, that I think is the follow-on from this, that takes it from the academia into the practical, is like, what do we do with this information?
Yeah, so they've discussed how they've got combined their research with the Collaborative Research Alliance, or the Cybersecurity Collaborative Research Alliance, so the CSEC-CRA. We have such really, really snappy names in cybersecurity for our things, don't we? And how they want to use this to kind of help mitigate against attacks of outright maliciousness. So as I say, they reckon it's not very well studied, so they've created, they're proposing to create a Maliciousness Assessment Metric. I've called it MAMA, and I'm just like, Mama just killed a man. That's how I will remember it. So yeah, people doing wrong. So the idea of actually metrics to do this, I'm all for it. There's nothing better when dealing with human factors. When I'm thinking of my time as an apologist, it's not easy to quantify human behavior. So if they're suggesting that they can do it, I want to see how they go about doing it.
I think it's also really challenging because maliciousness in itself is hugely contextual, because things like the Russian state basically is not condemning and might even be condoning some cybercrime and obviously nation state attacks. And what is malicious or what is damaging to one party is quite often a benefit or in some way positive to another party. And it gets really murky. We talked about last night about people in say Central Asia who work in these scam call centers. To them, it's just a job. Many of them aren't even thinking about whether the harms they're causing. It's a way of extracting money from a richer country, and they get paid. And they literally have performance reviews. They have targets to meet. They have their own desk. They have an office, and so that's probably a very different experience to somebody who, I don't know, is marginalized in our society or marginalized in their society, and then joins a hacking group or joins a cyberbullying, circle or something like that. Very, very different, despite both being malicious. So it's going to be difficult to get a measure that kind of one size fits all.
Yeah, and we'll jump ahead to the layers then, since you've already brought it up, because the cultural factors have a massive implication of how malicious activity is perceived. And there's a really fantastic book called Risk and Blame by anthropologist Mary Douglas, and she talks about how societies build taboos in order to kind of mitigate against people doing wrong things. But taboos are very much based on that individual's culture. So you might have taboos in one culture that just cannot be broken, and then in another culture those are not even taboos, they're just ways of living. And so everything is socio-technical. As human beings, we come with a lot of baggage, and that baggage really dictates our behavior. It dictates how we approach not only each other, but how we attach ourselves to social structures, like attacking other organizations, for example, either through hacktivism or through the desire to cause harm or have positive, for them, outcomes such as financial benefits to do so. So one of the kind of things the paper discusses also is that actually in all this, it's very hard to pin down these character traits, unfortunately, because quite a lot of these people doing malicious activities are wrong uns, and can you really trust what they would tell you if you even interview them? Basically, they're probably full of bullshit, even if you did kind of were to ask them about that. But yeah, you mentioned about the sort of layers, so let's kind of go into that. So according to this paper, as I say, think of it like an onion. So when people are out to cause malicious harm, there's loads of factors at play. So the individual is obviously really important. So let's start in the middle of the onion. So this is like inherent personal characteristics. So this is like personality traits. This is people's mental stability. It's their emotions. It's their self-perceptions and their attitudes. So all this sort of psychological stuff and prior history can increase the risk of them causing malicious behavior. And when I read that, it was kind of like, duh, yeah, dickheads be dickheads, for example. And that kind of will come into play of things. But what was more interesting is that it goes on to, as the layers kind of continue, it suggests that it's kind of a perfect storm. There are plenty of people out there that have had things go wrong in their lives, that had trauma and things, maybe being bullied and stuff. They all go out and commit cybercrime, for example. There's other things in play. So they go on to say that the macro level, this is the interpersonal interactions. This is the relationships with other people. It's to do with past experience and traumatic events, but also their perception of the social environment that they're in. So for example, the paper goes on to say things like people who have been neglected as children are kind of more likely to engage in malicious activity later on in life. Kids that find school difficult, either in terms of finding it challenging, usually bored kids, it said, is actually one of the big kind of problem levels there. And then it goes on to the next level, which is the meso level. I do like a good meso with bread and hummus and all that lot, but
very,
it's not quite the same.
poor. No.
The meso level starts then in that layer examining the group membership, and particularly with subcultures. So we've gone sort of like really close relationships, and then now we're starting to find our way in the world in terms of being part of a group. Subcultures, it suggests in this paper, can be quite dangerous because that's when you start getting reinforcements of the same behaviors and ideas. So what do I mean by that? Well, we're all part of groups all the time. Everyone's part of loads of different groups. Even the most loneliest person is usually part of some sort of group or identifies themselves with something. Taking the most common rhetoric at the moment, obviously there's lots of kind of nationalism at the moment in the UK, so people identify themselves as English, things like that. However, groups are based on shared values and norms, and if those shared values and norms are deviant and promote maliciousness as a acceptable way of going forward, then you can develop groupthink. And then that's when you start seeing, if people start falling into these groups, their core behavioural choices are then reinforced because that's the norm and that's valued by by those groups. And people falling into kind of these negative subcultures has strong links with things, again, like boredom, but also socioeconomic status. So people from sort of poorer backgrounds seeking to kind of make their way in things. Frustrations with authority, all these kind of things can lead to people wanting to join these groups so that they can find themselves in there. Because quite a lot of this paper, it suggests that people's lack of identity causes them to act more maliciously. And then finally, the kind of very outer layer is the broader cultural influences. So that's national values, that's the norms, how stable is their economy, the wider economy, the government structure, right down to the portrayals of cybersecurity attacks in the media and the legal status of such attacks. And that's when you touched upon, Jeff, about Russia and how that might differ there. But before I move on, anything you want to add on that?
There's a lot of layers to that, 4 of them. But I think one of the key things there is when you see the typical hacker and you go, well, that could have been me when I was younger. Especially when you start talking about maybe bored or unchallenged at school, or somebody who struggled to concentrate at school, because there's a lot of neurodiversity in tech. Some of the things mentioned, examples mentioned, were groups of men, because it's usually men, frustrated with their perception of women, which like leads to sort of incel kind of thinking. And then you look at some of these things, you go, these could be the origin story of anybody in tech. But at one point there was like a sliding doors moment, and they went into being a hacker or being a nerd, cybersecurity side of ne'er-do-well over actually going into tech. And I think it's very interesting how close the two things are, but for the want of maybe one or two life choices. So, but then again, one of the problems is the sort of the idea of like, it's I guess schema, the people's schema of the world or of organizations, how their built up perception of reality and how they choose to act on it. And I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know what are the key levers that make somebody one or the other. Maybe somebody, is it inherent traits of if he took me and then gave me an inherent trait of psychopathy, would I have become a hacker? I honestly don't know.
Well, what's interesting about that is that they do suggest that the very first layer, the individual layer, that things like narcissism and psychopathy, there is a link between them and malicious characteristics. But what got me thinking about that is it's really well known in other studies that CEOs have a high percentage of psychopathy and narcissism in their organizations. And if we put it back into perspective of why is that interesting for cybersecurity, could that be the reason why a lot of organizations take risks when it comes to cybersecurity?
I think it could well be. I think just in general, you look at the number of the Forbes 30 under 30 who ended up going to jail, I'd imagine it's a disproportionately large amount. And you look at the number of CEOs who get caught with their fingers in the till or doing something deeply unethical. And you have to wonder, how many organizations are run by people with those kind of behavioral traits where basically if we get found out, then we'll try and blame somebody else and move on. I think when we did an episode, I can't remember who it was with now, but talking about, the difference between a criminal organization and a legitimate organization can look very, very small when you at the sort of 50,000 feet level. Just one of them, properly files its taxes and it gets to operate in the open. And I think a lot, if you lift the hood of a lot of organizations, I suspect you'd see a lot of stuff you don't like. So,
yeah.
I mean, crime really is to get caught. I guess semantically, a crime has been committed, but unless you get caught, well, it's just a deed.
And that idea of who gets demonized is a really interesting concept. Again, going back to Mary Douglas, who will be the kind of anthropologist I will be referring to a lot in this piece, because I think she did work on risk and culture and another book called Risk and Blame, two very interesting books that I highly recommend. Again, that thing about to protect society, we all need to behave well to benefit from it. But then there is a subset of people in this world that are out to make it burn. And the way you get around that, if you are for example, a nation who is not able to function in a way that everyone else is, I'll be blatant here. So if you are, for example, a Western culture and you have lots of access to kind of positive reinforcement of kind of capitalism, but that kind of shared community, so like the EU, for example, then any kind of place that's excluded, so people like, Russia, people like North Korea and things like that, they have to redefine what good behavior looks like in order to succeed in a world like that. And so this paper actually does go into, there are crucial differences, and they do have a factor on people's perception of what malicious activity is. Again, the intent to do harm, and that is really dependent on where you grew up. So the three examples it gives is the United States, Russia, and China. So just kind of very briefly, what it says about the United States is with cybersecurity, the United States has gone through loads of big shifts in trends in perceptions of what hacking is. So back in the 60s, hacking takes on a positive connotation, and it's associated with sort of counterculture and the free flow of information and to resist conventional authorities, which you can kind of sort of see that, if you put into the context of the time, sort of like the hippie movement and things like that, it's about challenging authority. And then as sort of time went on and innovation kind of took hold and computers became more capable, and then we started talking about it more in films. Shout out to our upcoming podcast, Tech Film Wow, where we look at computing in films. But things like the WarGames start showing how technology can actually be very harmful and destructive to society. In the wrong hands, it can be used to cause quite masses of harms. And so then you sort of get from the 60s to the 80s, this kind of change of what computing might be and how it might be dangerous. And then we see that hackers, as the years go by, becomes associated with sort of civil disobedience. And then we see things like new laws come into place, like their equivalent of the kind of Computer Misuse Act.
I think didn't WarGames have a big influence on their Computer Misuse Act? Because I think
Yes.
because before that, like, just to be quite clear, and I think because people saw hacking as a mysterious act and kind of nothing wrong with it, because there was nothing wrong with it, because there was no law protecting it. You could, when there's no law against it and there's no, I guess, cultural, because the idea of things like digital theft, because remember at that point also nobody was online banking. I think online banking, although the earliest online banking was maybe in the late 80s, it was dial-up rather than in like web banking. The idea of digital theft didn't exist. Some of the things that we think of as being actually theft and actually wrong nowadays, there's no, I guess, no cultural or legal example. There was no precedent. It was an entirely new thing. So it's interesting to see that art influenced legislation and also the actual perception of some of these acts.
Yeah, and you're right. The WarGames was the catalyst. The regulator, the sort of CFAA, did call out and say that this is a realistic depiction of powers of personal computers, and so that film was a deciding influence. But what's interesting to me is that, and something to remember is, culture is always fluctuating. What was acceptable at one time can quickly become unacceptable, or vice versa, because culture is always changing, and it is always changing by our introduction to these concerns and concepts. So by having a film that does really well, the WarGames, really popular film, having that in the public perception then starts introducing that discourse into not only the public but also influencing our laws and behaviors going forward. The media in its various different guises has such an impact on how our acceptance of what is right and just in a society. So for example, the increase in AI companions over the last few decades, if we start with Blade Runner, for example, in the 1980s, and then move from to today for films like Her and Ex Machina, the sort of stark contrast there in how we perceive relationships with AI, for example, and artificial humans, that's explored in those narratives to a point now where people all over the world have AI companions on their phone and they're building relationships, even marriages with them. And you need media to introduce those topics, and lots of governments jump on this media discourse in order to inform how they are going to proceed with legislation.
I think it's fascinating that leans into something that you've always said, I think, is the power, and it's actually come up a lot in when we talked to guests on compromising positions. Human beings are almost all about storytelling. Like without storytelling, there's no culture, because how else do you transmit culture? I mean, you can do it by doing, but that's as human beings, we're limited by how much we can actually see and do physically. Even hunters and gatherers knew this thing. They had to storytell early language and drawings what it was like to hunt, or the things they saw. And now, certainly nowadays, as we're more remote than ever, storytelling is the way to build culture, and it's the way to build awareness and build discourse, I think. And nothing more true than tech, because science fiction exists. Somebody once said, I can't remember who it was, that good science fiction is almost indistinguishable from philosophy, and it should be science fiction, even if it's light pop culture science fiction, like WarGames, should be there to, in my opinion at least, to help promote discourse on interesting topics that haven't necessarily yet come to pass, but as it seems a lot of times actually do at some point come to pass.
Yeah, absolutely. And for good and for ill as well, which is why sort of at the moment everyone's access and the ability to be storytellers on a mass scale scale is both a beautiful thing and a terrifying thing.
Mm.
And then there's also the thing about control there as well. Who gets to control the narrative, and is that narrative accurate, and things like that. Which this
is
paper,
a rabbit hole.
yeah. Which this paper, it couldn't predict it at the time, perhaps 2018, about how we would engage with the media. There was probably rumblings, but definitely if we were to add another layer in, or include something into one of those layers, it would definitely be the social discourse that's surrounding people, that echo chamber. And that's the terrifying thing in these layers is the echo chamber. It's kind of a perfect storm. This malicious person needed to be exposed to certain elements, and in today's society we're actually making it easier for this person to be in that echo chamber.
Yeah, I mean the platforms, and certainly with like the various online safety acts and the EU equivalent, are trying to break that cycle of lack of moderation, of rabbit holing, of filter bubbling. Algorithmic media has got some great dangers to it. I think some of them are maybe slightly overblown, but it's important that very large online platform providers do take positive action to this. And what will happen is outside of America, they'll get spanked so badly that if they don't do something about this, so they're being forced to do it. But also, I think one of the things that we don't really kind of touch on a little bit, but doesn't really go, and I think this would be a useful extension, is to actually properly taxonomize the kind of malicious behaviors. Because some of these things, it's nothing to do with rabbit holes, nothing to do with filter bubbles. It's just some people want to make money. Some people want to make money. Some people want to act in the interests of their nation state. So what imagine if good patriotic US cyber person attacks an installation in, we'll say, Iran, as a cyber attack in Iran. That's a patriotic and good act, right?
Well, that's exactly
on the other side, it's a malicious act against a nation if you're Iranian.
Well, and that's precisely. Who would have thought? Maybe Jeff Watkins has also read this article too. This paper too. That's actually the example they give. So let's go back to American story time. So 60s hacker culture seen as a positive thing. It's kind of like sticking it to the man, but in a kind of positive way, and like people encourage it. WarGames in the 80s comes out, basically turns the tide. Oh no, hacking is dangerous. It can lead to destruction of humanity. And then later on, following that trend, things like hacking and hacktivism kind of becomes a grey area. Hacking in general is seen as a negative thing. It's against capitalism for someone to steal your money. Nobody likes, considering it's the country that invented the Wild West. It looks down upon people attacking its own infrastructure. However, it hacking other people's, that's when it becomes muddy. And so, as you say, the example it gives in this paper is Stuxnet, which is alleged, and I'm going to say alleged too because I don't want to get into any trouble either. Allegedly, the United States and Israel built and deployed the worm called Stuxnet, the most advanced piece of malware to exist, and it was used to physically damage nuclear centrifuges in Iranian nuclear facilities. So it highlighted, according to this paper, the global benefits of cyber warfare, such as low cost and low casualties. But as you can imagine, it kind of demonstrates that hacking is okay as long as you're on the right side, and that's the point, isn't it? And that's where we have to kind of discuss it with ourselves. So we have to discuss whether if blame is only really within the context of what is classed as heroic or not in a situation.
Yeah, but also I think from a practical point of view, it's a very interesting, I guess, philosophical debate. But I think it's more interesting when you start looking at the attribution when it's inside your organization, because where there's somebody inside your organization that's done something because they've been given access to do something, there's a reason why that happened, and there's a series of things that allow that person to be in that position or put that person in that position that maybe you could either prevent or detect. I think that's where it gets really, really practical. And that's why I think a taxonomy of all of the kind of types of malicious behavior or malicious actor would be a useful companion piece. And then along with, some of the actual levers that get them there, because there's a whole bunch of things, I think, internally that for insider threats that people could be thinking about to prevent that from being the case. Now, some of it, is like proper screening, because we've seen things like North Korean bad actors get remote jobs and go into organizations and then either just go and get paid, kind of slightly dodgy, but kind of doing their job and getting paid, or exfiltrating data, secrets, sensitive stuff. But then there's people who get into your organization and they end up being radicalized in their organization in some way. They think that maybe the management are unethical. Maybe they think that they've been wronged. Maybe they think they've been marginalized in their own organization. How can they get to that point where they act out and do something bad? And is there anything you do to detect it? I think that's super interesting, because One thing about insider threats is it's very difficult to provide a cyber defense against somebody who's actually doing the thing they're allowed to do.
Yes.
And whether or not you've given them, now, there's another question is, have you given them too many rights to do things they shouldn't be doing, which I think is actually quite often the case. And the other thing is, do you then how do you behaviourally monitor people to go, this is out of character?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I do have some suggestions, but we'll come to it towards the end. I'm just keen to finish off that, because this is one of my favourite parts of the paper, was the kind of difference between America, Russia and China. So the perceptions of Russia of hacking, according to this paper, is that it's culturally sanctioned. So as you see, sort of in America is actually, we don't want just the average Joe doing hacking, but in Russia, actually, yeah, we're quite happy with that. And there is a comparative acceptability of cybercrime in Russia, particularly in the last few years. What was really sort of interesting is talks about how in the 1980s, obviously it was Cold War, so a lot of the hacking activities were, Soviet government kind of sponsored, and a lot of it was actually to do with like piracy and things like that. And it was kind of getting one-upmanship on there, so it became very kind of nationalistic there. But when the wall came down in 1991, and there was like a movement, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, not the wall coming down. Russia started moving into more individualistic kind of economy. They began to become sort of more entrepreneurial, and then there was an opposition against that kind of central authority. They wanted to be more democratic, and what we kind of sort of see here is like the sort of shift from that hierarchical thing is like, if you're hacking for the state, then you're hacking for the good of all of us, whereas more individualistic kind of traits started coming out during the 90s, and that kind of then sort of led to a perception of cyber hacking as not as positive, because people just want to get on. They wanted to get on with their neighbors, they wanted to get on with the USA and stuff and not be sort of seen as part of that kind of old history. But obviously there was an economic crisis, kind of culminating between the 1998 to 2008, which then sort of led to the kind of Russia we all kind of know today, which is a lot more like the Russia of old, a lot more authoritarian going forward with that. And therefore, the financial crash actually saw a lot of skilled computer programmers lose their jobs, and then their only outlet was to become hackers for professional gain. And so we've sort of seen now that hacking skills is not only, again, become an acceptable career, but it's actually been used a lot to foster more nationalistic beliefs. One of the examples this paper gives is how in 2007, Russian nationalists were praised for attacking Estonia because they planned to remove a Russian war memorial. And so it's in Russia, it's become hacking is a patriotic kind of duty if you have the skills to do so, which is really interesting. And then finally, China, another state that kind of is well known for tolerating nationalistic hacking and things like that. They see it as a real strong part of their hybrid warfare strategy. But what they do that's slightly kind of different to Russia, according to this paper, is that they put a lot of cultural elements into when they're hacking. So a lot of linguistic phrases and values can be seen in their style of hacking. And again, another thing where it's just a lot of cultural pride associated it. So when you see, as you were saying earlier, Jeff, like if you're in a culture where hacking is really kind of a decent job, a decent way to make a living, then it's not a taboo. Then what does that mean for, if it's a taboo in your country, for example, in the UK, if it's a taboo in your country, how do you justify the fact that this has been done to you when you don't want to do that eye for an eye kind of retaliation?
Is it tricky? I mean, and this is why I think actually I don't think when it comes to outside of hacks, it's an interesting philosophical debate, but I don't think we can't control how other cultures view hacking. So unfortunately, that is just completely beyond our control. We can control internally how people see, I think through our own cultural awareness and making sure that people understand. One of the other things is people are marginalized. So one of the biggest hacks in recent times was within our own country, within our own shores, is making sure that people don't feel marginalized enough that they've got nothing to lose, or that they join a group who make them feel more welcome. Because marginalized people, then there's that kind of calculus of, is it worth doing the crime to do the time? That gets shifted. Very unbalanced. So some things, what somebody in a normal state of mind would think is actually got a good risk reward ratio. In the right state of mind, I think it was a bad risk reward ratio. In the wrong state of mind, would actually think it's a good risk reward ratio and would do it anyway. So I think that's what we see when you see marginalized people take those risks and then they get caught. Because most cybercrime doesn't get caught. It's like 95% of it doesn't get caught, or maybe more than that, because most of it actually originates somewhere else. And so even if we caught them, chance of prosecution is almost nil. In fact, 80% of all cybercrime prosecutions in this country, I believe, are members of the police force. Yeah, because it's people doing stuff on the PNC that they shouldn't be doing. and they get done for it. So that's 80%. And I think a good
Yes,
chunk
I've
of the
heard
other
this,
ones
yeah.
are people like misusing things like healthcare databases. So actual number of prosecutions and health, people going down for cybercrime in this country is minuscule, and it's not many of them are actual what we call hackers. They're people misusing resources. So I think it's important for us as a nation to make sure that people that people understand that calculus. If you're inside the UK and you want to hack, you're going to hack, you're probably going to get caught because we've got sophisticated intelligence. And is it worth it? Because people nowadays, ransomware it's tricky business, and it's also large organized, huge organized crime things. So individuals have got almost no chance. If you're going to do hacktivism, you're going to get caught for that as well. You're going to ruin your chances. And we make sure that people understand the gravity of the situation when it comes to getting caught hacking in this country, at least. And the same should go for when people are employees of organizations and misuse of services, because that's the only way people get done in maybe the healthcare sector, is because I'm just going to look up Mavis down the road's health record and see what she's had done. Like, no, you'll go to jail for that.
Absolutely. So that's the paper. So the kind of key insights that you can glean from this paper is that they suggest human behavior is as critical as code to understand. It calls people both risk inducers, so attackers, malicious insiders. So you're either a risk inducer or a risk mitigator, so you're an ethical defender or a vigilant user. Try putting that on your Tinder profile. So in society, you're either one or the other. But maliciousness is situational as well, because people aren't born malicious. There's lots of different factors that lead to why they would act maliciously, under stress, marginalization, their cultural framing, and things like that. Maliciousness as well is a social judgment. It's definitely based.
Yeah,
it's absolutely contextual, based on how culture shapes that idea of maliciousness, and that's not only shaped on an individual level, but also at national level, as in the cases of Russia and China, where attack might be seen as justice rather than something negative. And again, as we probably already know, that motivations for people being malicious vary wildly. Financial gain, revenge, ideology, boredom, and now we know cultural pride as well. So how do we wrap all that up into something, dear listeners, that you can start using today? Well, it's not an easy one, because people are really complex and everyone has so much different cultural baggage. This is the one thing, my criticism of this paper is that it suggests putting the human in the loop. And as loyal listeners will know, I'm a massive fan of that myself. However, I'm very cognizant of the fact that, we're technologists, we're not psychologists, damn it, as Scotty would say.
I'm worried about it becoming almost like cyber phrenology. People used to study people's skulls and say, oh, you have the kind of jutting forward brow of a career criminal. And I'm worried that people go, oh, you have the, online behavior of somebody who looks like they're going to steal their employer's data. I do worry about people getting overly happy with some of these things. And also there's kind of like an ad hominem kind of thing, maybe once upon a time, because what it does directly suggest, criminal history in talking about the risk factors. Well, okay. Actually, a lot of organizations are trying to recruit talent from a criminal history background, people who are reformed, people, hopefully who are not recidivists. That's a hard word to say. So I just worry about going too far with it, because it also, it feels it could dip into pseudoscience quite easily, but also we do need something practical.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd have to read it again, but I can't think of where it accounts for the fact of neurodiversity as well, which might also influence behavior, but not necessarily in a negative way. What I'm trying to say here is actually there are some elements that it describes as being negative traits that might lead to more malicious activity, which in fact are social isolation and the preference to be on one's own and things like that. And I like to be on my own, so and I don't commit cybercrime.
The big five traits, the big five positive traits, one of them is extrovertism. And it's like, that's weird amongst the other, agreeableness and a couple of other things. I can't remember the other ones, but extroversion, sorry. I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think that's an overly judgmental way of viewing people's positive traits. And I wouldn't necessarily say lack of extroversion is a negative trait. So you've got to be really careful when you psychological stuff.
And so wrapping it up and sort of putting it into kind of a business context of how we would use this. Well, there is something to be said about understanding your people. It's very difficult for us though, however, because I don't think many organizations hire cybersecurity people with a background in psychology and anthropology.
They don't even hire many cybersecurity people.
If you do want to, hint, I'm about. But realistically, that just is not where most cybersecurity professionals come from as a background. And I think it can be dangerous as well to give people a couple of psychology books and say, go have at it. Yeah, and do some pseudo-psychology as well.
I think that there's a lot of practical things, though, that are just good practice anyway that people can do. Actually having an organizational culture where people feel like they're listened to, and it means they have some form of redress when there's grievances, or that if there's changes that need to be made in the business, that they feel like they're listened to and that change is happening. And making sure that people don't get basically stopping people from becoming marginalized or radicalized or having a lack, things like stress factors can prevent rational thought, or they can damage rational thought. So if you've got somebody who's literally breaking down because you are piling stress on them, they're not psychologically safe and they're snapping, that might be a good factor that leads them to do a malicious act that they wouldn't have done under normal conditions. So just, I think, really good organizational hygiene doesn't require you then to be a psychologist to help mitigate some of these factors for maliciousness, including also having the least principal privilege and making sure you deal with changes in role quickly enough that people don't have rights they shouldn't have. If you do the good organizational hygiene, what you do is you actually start to, when we talked about those 4 factors of rationality, expertise and competence, maliciousness and insider access, actually you start to mitigate some of that without even having to go too deep into the psychological elements, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did a talk recently. I updated it. I first did this talk in 2022, and it's based on another piece of research about using Glassdoor reviews to predict when your next breach was going to happen. And by breach, I don't mean necessarily cyber breach, but any kind of incident that you would rather avoid in the media. And using frequency of words, negative words that are found in Glassdoor reviews as a means to sort of track organizational culture. Now, that paper suggested that with using Glassdoor reviews, you were able to predict when a company was going to have its next incident within the space of 2 years, which is really interesting. So it does take time for culture to kind of break down in this sense. And you could use those principles along with this paper to understand, actually, are you seeing these personality traits present to help build a picture, not to kind of conclude it, but to kind of help build a picture there.
I think also using those kind of markers would be now in the advent of generative AI and we can do a lot of this processing, could be wider. You could look at wider things around socials, and because it's a really good example. Glassdoor's a super good example. I think there's other markers you can start to look, and people will be able to now, behavioral analytics, AI-driven behavioral analytics are becoming possible inside organizations, whereas they suggest in the paper, because it's 2018, that this is not practical to monitor people's behavior, but you might be able to say, like, monitor Slack behavior and be able to detect the chances of insider, or even looking at things like socials, looking at outside threats as well. So I think there's some really interesting. I was surprised at how well it led back to your talk you did based on that paper. It almost created a really interesting continuum of narrative, but actually AI can actually help us with all of this and can actually bring all of this together. And it will be it's almost like a completely new way of looking at the threat landscape, rather than here's some vulnerabilities, here's some nation state rumblings.
Well, maybe in the next episode where we'll go in and do a deep dive on that, because that does have practical examples and can only really be increased now with using machine learning to really kind of help automate this kind of process. But I just wanted to end. So Mary Douglas, the anthropologist that I referred to earlier, who talks about risk quite a lot, she suggests or reminds us that risks are socially selected. So when a culture frames insider threats as a bigger risk than external hacking, it's not objective, it's political, it's subjective, and it reflects workplace values. And that's kind of be really interesting, because no one can precisely calculate total risks they face, but we can only act on the information that we have. And that brings a lot of uncertainty, especially when it comes to making justifications to our leadership boards and users.
I think, because remember, risk is only ever a calculus, because risk is something that hasn't happened yet. It's when you get an issue, if you do a RAID log, risks, issues, assumptions and dependencies, you make a lot of assumptions are also things that have probably not happened yet. Risks are something that it's when things are issues, unfortunately, there's that great book by the time you read this is too late. Unfortunately, with cyber stuff, by the time it's become an issue, it's quite often too late. So risk calculus is and it is politicized. And I agree, I think it is, but also I think it's also in people's agendas to sometimes politicize it, because people know there is, as we said before, CEOs sometimes much more risk accepting than maybe they should be in some organizations, or they're unwilling to accept the assessment of risk. So some people probably do need to overplay these a little bit and actually politicize risk. But one of the things we can control is at least some way is insider threat a little bit. We can control some of it. We can't control the outsider threat, really. Not as in normal normal organizations. We can't control that.
But yeah, organizations need to decide what threats they're going to prioritize. But in doing so, they are also making moral statements about whose safety and whose interest matters most. To end again with Mary Douglas, every definition of risk also contains an image of justice, which I think is a very lovely line. And that has been our analysis into the paper Characterizing and Measuring a Maliciousness for Cybersecurity Risk Assessment by King et al. Links to the paper will be in the show notes. Where possible, we will always try and include readily accessible papers. However, if not, we will go and ask for permission to share them. And if they say no, you can always email these writers. They are always happy to share them. That has been the first episode of the new Compromising Positions. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you welcome us back to the fold again and forgive us for our transgressions. It wasn't malicious, I promise. And we're looking forward to sharing some really interesting insights, things that should be of interest, that you will not hear this sort of stuff in the traditional cybersecurity media. So come to us to get all your unique insights on how to do cybersecurity with the human in mind. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Compromising Positions, the podcast that brings you the latest insights from around the world on cybersecurity, AI, and all things tech. Keep safe, keep secure, remember to ask yourself, am I the compromising position here?